Welcome to Vibrational Revelations. My name is Elena.
I am Alejandro.
And we have a very special guest today, and his name is Seán ÓLaoire. Seán is originally from Ireland. He's living in the United States currently. He has several very interesting things in his background: undergraduate in mathematics, PhD in transpersonal psychology, and also a Catholic priest, which he says is from with a smaller letter C. So, Seán, if you could please explain to us what the smaller C is, and then take us on a journey of how you went from mathematics into Catholicism and into transpersonal psychology.
Great questions, Elena. And so when I say the small C, I spent 8 years in a Roman Catholic seminary. I was ordained on the 4th of June, 1972. So next June will be my 50th anniversary. I worked as a missionary in East Africa for 14 years. But my theology as such, I learned from the native African mythologies and folklore. And I began to reassess my cosmology and my understanding of spirituality. And so I went, I believe, from kind of a fundamentalist Catholic Roman Catholicism to a kind of a universal spirituality, mystical spirituality. And in that process, as I was, preaching and writing about my new ideas, I fell, in disfavor with Rome. And so on the 4th of October, 2010, which is the Feast of St. Francis, one of my heroes, I got a 2-page letter in Latin from the Vatican telling me that I was being dismissed and that I could no longer represent myself as a Catholic theologian or teach in any Catholic institute, and that the only way I could exercise my priesthood was if I came across somebody who was dying and there was no other priest to hear his confession, I could hear his confession and offer him absolution. And so I went at that stage from being a Catholic with a capital C, which meant, part of this organization called the Roman Catholic Church, to being Catholic in the sense of universal, which is what it really means, a universal priest, that I take my priesthood from my incarnation. And one of the things I say to my own congregation every Sunday, as I begin the Eucharist, I celebrate the Eucharist every Sunday for my congregation, and I do it through Zoom now. And I said to them, every single one of you is a priest. Your ordination ceremony was your incarnation. And therefore, if you have the elements in your home, if you've got bread and wine and candles, I want you to offer and consecrate and receive communion in your own homes. And so for me at this stage, I'm a Catholic priest with a small c, because for me, the Catholic family is much bigger than and much more important than the institution which calls itself the Roman Catholic Church. So that's kind of a brief understanding of this small c. So you want me to give kind of more background to my own journey then?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I grew up in Ireland, obviously, as you can hear from my accent. I was born on the 8th of October, 1946. I just celebrated my 75th birthday. And I was the firstborn of a firstborn of a firstborn. So I'm the firstborn of my parents. My father and mother were both firstborns in their family. And my father's mother was the firstborn in her family. So I'm the first great-grandchild. And my great-grandmother was still alive. In fact, I was almost 10 years old before she died. And I called her Muddy. I couldn't pronounce her name. We spoke a mixture of Gaelic and English in my home. I couldn't pronounce her name, so I called her Muddy. And everybody called her Muddy subsequently. And Muddy was a Christian mystic. For Muddy, the Mother Mary was more real to Muddy, my great-grandmother, than you and I are to each other right now. And so I spent the first 7 years in her company, listening to her, and she would speak aloud to Mother Mary. And I was privy to these conversations. And so then, the mystical world became as real as the physical world to me. And then at age 7, I went back to live with my other grandparents, where my grandfather was my maternal grandfather, whom I called Daddy Jim. And he was like a druid. He was a great storyteller. He was a consummate musician. He played the clarinet, the tin whistle, the concert flute, the squeeze box, the fiddle. And he was a great Irish step dancer. And so he filled up my mind with all of these great ancient Irish myths. And so I developed a great love for mythology, which I believe is the archived wisdom of a culture. Myth is not something that primitive peoples make up because they're not scientific. Myth is the encapsulation and the archiving of the deep wisdom of a culture, and they put it in story form because it's entertaining, it's informative, and it is transformative. And the purpose of any myth or any story is to transform the audience, not simply to entertain them, or even to inform them. It does that as well. And so by the time, I went to the seminary when I finished high school, spent 8 years studying theology, scripture, a little bit of philosophy. And in the course of that, I went to the National University of Ireland, where I did a double major in pure mathematics and mathematical physics. And then I went to Kenya, spent 14 years in Kenya. And I have a penchant for being thrown out of places every so often. So I was thrown out of Kenya after 14 years because I was opposing the corruption of the government. I had an encounter with the president of the country, who was a member of the Tugen tribe, and I spoke that language fluently. And I approached him at a public meeting because of the corruption that was happening in my area. There was a very bad famine in 1984-85, and I was bringing in food from outside, 3 lorry loads of food every month, and distributing in the villages. And a local politician was taking the food at gunpoint from his own people, using government troops and selling it. And so he and I clashed furiously. So I had this encounter with the president, and I was told I needed to leave the country. So I left there in 1986, spent a year in London studying Jungian psychology and learning hypnotherapy, which I included subsequently in my clinical work. And then I came to the States in 1987 and did a PhD in transpersonal psychology. So I'm now a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of California. And then I worked in the Diocese of San Jose for about 8 years. And then they found my theology too weird. I was advocating very strongly for women priests. And I was talking a lot about reincarnation, which I believe very strongly in, because I've had about 11 reincarnational experiences personally. And so I was ordered out of the diocese in 1995. So we set up an organization, a non-denominational group of people who are interested in fashioning their own cosmologies, and inquiring themselves. So it is called Companions on the Journey, and that's the group for which I'm the spiritual director right now. Yeah, that's a brief kind of a
yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to ask you your own awakening into realization to question things. So when you were trained as a Catholic priest and you were saying that you went to Africa, is that where a lot of your awakening and realization started happening for you, as far as the system that you learned and what is actually happening?
You must be psychic, Elena. That's exactly what happened. So I got to Africa. I'm 26 years of age. I'm, Irish. I know everything. And I've the last year in the seminary, they taught us something called community development, where you go into a new culture. You would figure out, what the problems in the area are, what the resources are, who the leaders are, what the solutions might be. So I've just learned Swahili, and I'm sitting one day at a meeting of the elders, that we call the Wazee, in 122-degree temperature on the edge of the desert out of doors, and it's a very, very barren area. So I'm lecturing these old men, I understand you're the leaders. I know what the problem is here. We need water. I've got a plan. I know resources in Europe that can help this, and then going on and on and on. I see this old man with this kind of bemused smile on his face. He puts up his hand. He says, "Can I ask you a question?" And I'm 26. I'm Irish. I know everything. Sure, fire it. And he says to me, and we're speaking Swahili. So what he says more or less was, he says, "Can you tell me why is it that for you Europeans, your only response to a problem is to want to solve it?" I'm thinking, dude, what the hell do you do with a problem except solve it? So I'm stuck. For the first time in my life, I'm stuck. So I said to him, "What do you do when you encounter a problem?" And I'll never forget what he said. He said, "A problem is an invitation to self-transcendence. And if all you do with the problem is solve it, life will just give you another problem." And I've never forgotten it, that a problem is an invitation to self-transcendence. And the thing is, when you accept the invitation to self-transcendence, then you have a far superior, kind of perspective. So when you come down to solving the problem, you're dealing with it at a much, much greater level, because you have a bird's eye view of what it involves. You're not making one change that causes difficulties, 2 or 3 years down the road. So I began to think about that. So I began to think about the fact that I'm living in a culture. I came here to educate these people, to take them from the darkness of their pagan ways to the light of Christianity. I began to see they have a wisdom, they've got mythology, they've got a spirituality, which is not just about Sunday worship, or not eating meat on a Friday if you're Catholic. So I began to look at the tenets of my own belief system. I examined my own cosmology. And, Socrates would say the unexamined life is not worth living. And Gautama Siddhartha would call himself the Buddha, the one who was awake. And Jesus Christ would say, if the householder knew at what time the thief was going to break in and steal, he wouldn't go to sleep. So they're all talking about being awake. So I'd be thinking, I need to come awake. I need to examine the tenets of my belief system that have been ingrained in me from childhood and examine them. So one by one, I would take a tenet, something like, there's a man in Rome who wears a pointy hat. He's called the Pope and he's infallible. Now, if I hadn't been born Catholic, if I'd been born Jewish or Hindu or Muslim, would I believe that? Absolutely not. So I threw that one out. I take a tenet like, do not do to other people what you would not like them to do to you. If I were born Hindu or Buddhist or Jain, and I heard that, would I agree with that? Absolutely. Okay, that goes into a different bucket. So I made 2 buckets of my belief systems, and you discarded a whole bunch. And I then created a whole new cosmology. So that was the beginning of my awakening. And then, so the first book I wrote, Ukweli, Nini, Truth, What Does That Mean? It was my first attempt to create a cosmology, which was kind of the cross-fertilization of African wisdom and my Roman Catholic mystical core, not the fundamentalist doctrine, but the mystical core of it. So that was the beginning, just as you intuited.
So you actually posed a huge threat because you started questioning the institution itself.
Exactly.
And, it brings us to, of course, this is your 6th book, and I want people to see your book, and it's called Setting God Free. And perhaps you can dive a little bit into it, because in this book, you talk about putting God on trial.
Right.
And you go into how as humans, we've created this sociopathic version of God, right? Where God, and there's very specific things in the Bible, right? In the scriptures where he kills individuals or just large populations. And I'd love for you to talk about that, because it's actually, this is the programming that we're all facing at the moment, because if we're seeing, right, the outside or the so-called God or the universe is violent, then what can we expect from one another?
Right. We have personified God, right?
Exactly. And so what I'm doing in this book is I divided it into 4 kind of sections. I wanted to put God on trial for crimes against humanity. But in order to do that, I needed to tell people, what is the origin of the Bible? And the Bible developed over a period of from about 950 BCE to the end of the Christian scriptures, about 100 AD. So you're talking about a 1,000-year period of evolution. And it's an ongoing conversation between local communities, and their particular kinds of issues. And so every group is trying to tailor the story to the exigencies of their own situation. So it's influenced by politics, it's influenced by, finances, it's influenced by warfare, all these things. And so the God that comes out is this psychopathic, genocidal tyrant. He starts off by throwing 2 innocent people out of a garden for an act of disobedience. Now, if you look at that one story, for instance, the story alleges that God created Adam and Eve, put them into a garden, gave them all the gifts they need, and said, but there are 2 trees in the garden you're not allowed to eat from. There's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You cannot eat of that tree. And then there's the tree of life that confers immortality. You can't eat that tree either. But everything else you can eat. Broccoli, sprouts, apples, whatever you want, you can eat. Now, they're pre-rational beings, according to the story. They're like 4-year-old kids. They haven't reached the use of reason. And so they can't extrapolate And so they decide to test it. And what does God do? He throws them out of the garden in perpetuity, and their kids and their grandkids, and then he puts angels at the gate to make sure they can't get back in. If that happened in the state of California, where I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, I'd be mandated to report that guy to the Child Protective Services. Literally.
Yeah.
Two pre-rational kids, and he punished them in perpetuity for an act of disobedience for the situation they couldn't understand because they're pre-rational. They're little children at the stage, and he throws them. That was the first thing. And then he wiped out all of creation except 8 people, you know, because he was really upset with the way people were behaving. And then again and again and again, he has massacres of people. You know, and then he instructs Moses to massacre people, and thinking, this God can't be real. And so I worked my way through the entire, particularly the first 5 books of the Hebrew scriptures, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And I created a trial, a prosecution and a defense. And for the prosecution, I brought in a Bible scholar to read us through the Bible. I brought in a clinical psychologist to look at, you know, how I would diagnose this God. He's a manic depressive. He swings between really mood swings. He has impulse control disorder. He's definitely, you know, bipolar. He has paranoid schizophrenia in that he thinks he's God. He inflates his own ego. He's constantly moving between paranoia about being overthrown by other gods and beating his chest and claiming what a great God he is. So I brought in a clinical psychologist, and I brought in a contract lawyer to show that he broke the covenant again and again and again and again. And then I brought in, for the defense, another a Jungian analyst to talk about projection. And I brought in an archaeologist to look at the actual findings. Was there ever an Exodus? Was there ever a Moses? And I looked at another Bible scholar as well. And I brought in a mythologist to explain the meaning of story. So I held a complete trial. And what I found out at the end was that we had the wrong person on trial. This God, you know, that allegedly committed all of these atrocities is a projection of the human shadow. And we can go into the notion of projection if you're interested. It's a notion of Carl Jung. But literally, the God we've been forced to worship and to fear is a projection of all that is dark in the human shadow as individuals, as communities, and as a world species. And so we who were created in God's image and likeness have created a God in our own image and likeness and then feared that God. So that's basically what I'm doing in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant. Mm-hmm. So how would you say, for people that are following dogmatic belief systems, what would you say would be an advice to awaken, to help them awaken to that very programming?
The awakening has to do with the substitution of love for fear. Because ultimately, I believe that every little infant is born just with 2 emotions from the moment that the child arrives. The ability to feel fear and the ability to feel love. Now, fear, when it is self-directed, becomes depression and anxiety. And fear, when it's other-directed, becomes anger and rage. And love, when it is self-directed, becomes self-esteem. And love, when it is other-directed, becomes compassion. So now we got 4 pieces. And these 4 pieces combine and permute, and they create all of the virtues and all of the vices. I guarantee you, if you were to archaeologically dig down through any vice at the basis, you'll find fear. If you were to dig down through any virtue, you'll find love at the core of it. So basically, there's this oscillation between love and fear in the little infant. And the greatest fear a little infant has is the fear of not being lovable. Not just not being loved, but being unlovable. And so that's why a little infant cries when mother departs, because the child can't comprehend why this God figure, which is the mother for him, has abandoned him. So why would she abandon him? The reason must be, I am unlovable, because the child can't understand mother needs to go to the bathroom or go grocery shopping. So that when mother disappears, the child feels, oh my God, I'm abandoned. And I'm abandoned because I am unlovable. So that's the basic struggle in the human psyche. And we visit that in all our relations subsequently, whether it's interpersonally, intercommunally, or in our relationship to this sky being that we've called God. So we're oscillating between love and fear. And all of the mystics tell us again and again and again, God is love. In fact, you know, I was just thinking a few nights ago, after our last conversation, if I had to define consciousness, they call consciousness the hard problem in science. And it's very difficult to come up with, a definition of consciousness. Mm-hmm. And in a dream about 2 or 3 nights ago, I got a definition of consciousness. And that I understood that consciousness is the primordial, pre-cosmic, love-saturated self-awareness. That's what it is. Mm-hmm. It's the primordial, pre-cosmos, love-saturated self-awareness. And everything flows from that. The phenomenal realms, then that which we can experience is saturated with divine love. But we have created this monster. And so when you tap into your core, the thing that most attracts any one of us is the experience of loving another or being loved by another. And that is the orienting mechanism. That is what tells you God is present. That is where God is. And that fear is created, by the projection of our shadow material and the induction of fear-based dogmatic, control mechanisms of various kinds, whether they're financial or military or, economic or religious. And so orienting towards your core inner kind of GPS, and then following that guidance. And then you find God and you find love, and you realize that there is nothing except love. That even fear is the need for love. Fear is the kind of anxiety that I won't be loved. So it's even fear is love based.
Just a lack of love, right?
Exactly, lack of love, or a feeling that I don't deserve to be loved. Not only am I not experiencing love, I'm unlovable. Nobody could love me ever. So there's something deeply flawed about me, and religious systems, and control mechanisms latch onto that. And then they build fear into the systems, right? Like we're doing, in the world right now. You make people afraid, and they'll turn to any kind of a false god that can save them from their present predicament.
And they give their power away, and they're easier to control, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So what's interesting is, because it brought me into realization, the fear and love, would you say that they're part of everything that is?
Yes.
Because it creates the contrast to experience more love. So fear is one of the ingredients, right? Absolutely. What we discovered is what we would call the shadows, right? So the shadow, we have shadow characters that are playing role in this reality as shadow, and of course those that are in the light. What's interesting in our revelations, and I'd love to hear from you as well, is a lot of the shadow people, true shadow players that we reveal are 100% in alignment with divine purpose. Okay. Which is fascinating. And, we've discovered this testing people over and over and over using vibrational frequency analysis. Do you see that shadow somehow from a divine perspective plays an important role in acknowledging or revealing more of the light for the light to rise? Would you say that that is part of the stories, part of the myths that you've been going deep into, and part of what you've realized over the years as well?
I think that's a brilliant question. It's a hugely complex phenomenon. So the first piece I would say is that I was walking along a trail. I live in the forest. I was walking along a trail a few days ago, a bright sunlight day. And there was a tree that was bowed over into it had created almost like a circle. And as I walked, the sun was shining through it, and it was creating a shadow to my right-hand side. And I was right inside of the middle of the circle. And the shadow of my body was situated right in the middle of this light shadow with the shadow of the tree around it. And I began to realize that, a shadow is an invitation to realize that I'm putting an obstacle between myself and the sun. And so in some senses, shadow plays a hugely important part in understanding the light, because the only way shadow can be created is by putting some kind of an obstacle in the path of the light. And often we take the light for granted, and we don't understand that we're in the light until the shadow allows us to see differently. So when you go to a movie theater, for instance, the realization that you must have is this: there's a real film up in the projectionist box that's spinning around, and there's a white light that's shining through it onto a huge screen, 40 feet by 40 feet screen. Now you could go back into the projectionist box and watch the movie one frame at a time, 1 inch by 1 inch, and it will be a really boring way to watch the movie. Or you can watch it on the screen where it's enlarged and projected. But the interesting thing is, the part that you're seeing is the part that's not there. What do I mean by that? There's this white light and you're occluding parts of it by blocking out some parts of it. And it's the parts that are blocked out that are creating the images on the screen. So it's the part where the light does not exist. The part that the light can't get through is the part that's actually creating the figures on the screen. Now, a very famous thinker once called this, he said, he called it creation by subtraction. And the phrase he used was, by limiting infinite possibilities, we create finite realities. By limiting infinite possibilities, we create finite realities. It is by occluding portions and thus limiting the light that we create our reality models. So when you see John Wayne, if you're looking at a black and white movie and there's John Wayne riding across the stage on his horse, you don't see, John Wayne is the part that's not there. John Wayne is the part where the light is blocked out. So you couldn't see John Wayne unless the light had been blocked out. So in some senses, that's the extraordinary value of the shadow. The shadow allows us to see in a way that the light cannot allow us to see. Because if we lived only in love, we would be totally unaware that love exists. If we lived only in light, we would be totally unaware that light exists. It's like a fish in the ocean. It's aware of the wetness, but it has no concept of ocean. It knows it's wet, but has no idea that there's an ocean. So if we lived only in light, we would have no idea what light was. So shadow, by limiting infinite possibilities, we create finite realities. What you're seeing on the screen is the part that's not there. And without that, you wouldn't be able to kind of now transcend and see what actually is there, which is only light. So that's the function, in some senses, of the shadow.
Mm-hmm. That's beautifully said.
Yes.
Makes total sense that the contrast is extremely important to actually experience,
Right.
Its own divinity, I would say, for
the light
each of us.
to its fullest extent.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So I would differentiate. Sorry,
Go ahead. Yes.
I would differentiate them between kind of two philosophical terms, phenomenology and ontology. Ontology is the branch of philosophy that deals with reality, what is real. And phenomenology is the branch of philosophy that deals with what can be experienced. And for most of us, we conflate the two. We think phenomenology is the same as ontology, that what we experience is reality. And it is not. If what we experience is a tiny subset of reality. It's the reality that's delivered to us by our sensorium and by this tiny little 3-pound computer we carry between our ears. That's the little tiny slice of reality that's captured by our sensorium and by our scientific equipment. So phenomenology is just that little slice that can be experienced, but it is nothing like the totality. It's like, it's the difference between Shakespeare and his collected works. There's a lot more to Shakespeare than his collected works. He was a human being with a family and a wife and kids and lived in a place. And his collected works are a little slice of who he was. So by reading the works of Shakespeare, you only get a tiny impression of who Shakespeare was as a person. So phenomenology is to ontology as the collected works are to the man himself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so we keep making the mistake that, the reality that our sensorium delivers to us is the total reality, and it is not. So there are like three levels to reality. There's the individual experiences, which becomes my reality, and then the culture does a kind of in mathematics, the intersection set between all of the people and their individual realities, and then there's a subset that we all have in common, and we call that the cultural reality. And it becomes almost possible to have an experience outside of that cultural reality because you'll be called crazy if you do. And outside of that is ultimate reality. It is God reality. And so when we think about reality, there's three subsets. There's the individual version of it, there's the cultural version of it, and then there's the ultimate version, which is the God version. And shadow allows us to transcend by identifying the fact that we're dealing with an incomplete picture. It allows us to access different dimensions and different levels of the soul in order to be able to engage with and encounter and experience many, many, many different levels of reality. the level at the etheric body, at the astral body, at the mental body, at the psychic body, at the soul body, and at the cosmic body.
This is why in our work also we say we can't judge the shadow, because the shadow plays such an important role for us to acknowledge, and you talk about this a lot, to acknowledge our own divine essence, the God within. And I'd love for you to touch upon that when you spoke about Mary and Archangel Gabriel who came to her, and the message she received, and what does it mean for every human being on this planet?
Great question, Elena. And so in the mystical part of Roman Catholicism is really beautiful. And there's a beautiful practice, a ritual called the Rosary. Anybody who was raised Catholic, you know, going back a bit would understand that. And there were kind of 3 sets of mysteries that you prayed with the Rosary. There were the joyful mysteries, the sorrowful mysteries, and the glorious mysteries. And in the joyful mysteries, there was 5 mysteries in each section. There was the Annunciation to Mary by Gabriel that she was being invited to be the mother of the Mashiach, the Messiah. Then there's the visitation to her cousin Elizabeth, who's an old woman who's gotten pregnant. And then there's the nativity, the baby is born. And then at age of 8 days, there's the presentation of the child in the temple. And then at age 12, he's lost in the temple. So I began looking at that in much more depth. What does that mean? What does it mean that 2,000 years ago, a messenger from God approached a young woman in Galilee and asked if she would be the mother of God? Now, the truth is, that is the invitation extended to every single soul who volunteers for incarnation. This didn't just happen once 2,000 years ago to a beautiful advanced soul called Mary of Galilee. It happens to every single one of us. Every single one of us volunteered and said to God, send me. I will be a God carrier. I will come into the world and I will try to be a light bearer. I will try to wake up the world to its cosmic origins and to its divine core. But then when we're born, there's this extraordinary amnesia created for who we are. And so we who are outside of space and time are now bound by this tiny little physical body, 8 pounds of body. And we have to deal with a little laptop, which we carry between our ears. And then we have this, we're foisted into a chronology, a notion of time, which doesn't exist outside of incarnation. Time is an artifact of a particular state of consciousness. And now we have to operate with time, with space, you know, with this tiny little body. And we're dealing with amnesia for the fact of who we really are, how we volunteered, what we volunteered to do, and we spend our entire lifetimes, you know, chasing baubles. And Mary was aware of why she had come, and so she said, "Yes, I will do it." But every single one of us, you know, was given the same invitation. Will you agree to be a mother of God? Will you agree to be a God carrier? Very famous, I think, probably the greatest Christian mystic of all time, Meister Eckhart, in the late, you know, 1200s and 1300s, said very famously, on a Christmas homily he gave one time, he said, "Of what value to me is it that my God was born of a virgin, you know, 1300 years ago? If he's not born again, in my time and in my heart, every single one of us was meant to be a mother of God." And I believe that at the core of my being. Every single human being volunteered to be a God carrier to planet Earth. But 95% of us are asleep at the wheel. And that's what we do. When Mary and Elizabeth then encountered each other, you know, Elizabeth is 3 months pregnant, and she is a woman who had never had a child and was way beyond childbearing age, and she's pregnant with the child who will become John the Baptist. And when Mary greets her, the child leaps in her womb. And Elizabeth says, "Oh my God, as soon as you arrived, the baby in my womb leaped for joy because he recognized that you're carrying God." Now, Elizabeth also was carrying God. It wasn't that just, you know, John the Baptist in utero recognized the only Son of God in Mary's womb. It was that one, you know, a soul recognized the other soul. I call that the Christian namaste. The divine in me recognizes and honors the divine in you. And then there's a beautiful prayer. Mary says, "My soul magnifies the Lord." Now, as a small boy, I couldn't understand what did that mean, because I knew that Mary was this extraordinary soul, but to magnify means to make something much bigger than it originally was. So how could Mary, as a human being, magnify God? I couldn't understand it. And then about age 7, I had an experience and it suddenly clicked. I found a magnifying glass that fell out of my grandmother's eyeglasses, and I started experimenting with it. And my father had a motorbike. It was a BSA 250cc motorbike, to which he went to work every day, which is about 7 miles away. We lived in the countryside. And he started setting fire to stuff with the magnifying glass, piece of paper, and then straw. And then I set fire to my father's motorbike, to the saddle on the bike right next to the petrol tank. And he ran out and hit me upside the head and got a fistful of dirt and threw it on the petrol tank. Otherwise, it would have exploded. And I understood that day what Mary meant. Here was this sun 93 million miles away, this huge fiery orb. But it could not set fire to my father's motorbike on its own. It needed this tiny piece of glass to do it. And that's what Mary was saying. I am the tiny piece of glass that magnifies God's effect in planet Earth. But the glass had to have two factors. It had to be clean or clear, otherwise it's going to diffuse the rays. And secondly, you have to find the exact focal length. If it's too far away, the rays have focused and they're spreading again. And if it's too close, they haven't focused yet. So you have to get the exact focal length. So that means that you have to be in the exact right relationship with everybody in your life at every stage of the relationship, because it changes. The focal length of your relationship with an infant is different from the focal length of your relationship with the same child at age 2 or age 10 or age 15. And so that was the greatness of Mary, that for all the people in her life, she knew the exact focal length of her baby to adopt with her baby. And there's this fascinating thing that when the mother is breastfeeding her baby, the actual focal length of an infant's and neonate's eyes is the distance between her nipple and her eyeball, the mother's. So the child is born with the exact focal length while it's nursing to focus on its mother's eyes. That's what it means to magnify God. And so when I think of Mary, I think of her not as a kind of a once off, but as the prototype, the one who woke up to the realization of the purpose of incarnation, that every single one of us is meant to be a God carrier, and that she represents that as did Jesus, that is our fun. That's the only reason we're here, to wake ourselves up, to wake each other up, and to wake the planet up.
Mm-hmm. And that stems from thinking of God as an unlimited being, right? And instead of personifying God. What is your definition of evil? You somewhat touched on, and what is truth, and how can one identify truth?
Okay, that's brilliant. So let me take them in reverse order, Alejandro.
Yes.
I have my own definition of truth. For me, something can be factual, but not true, and something can be true, but not factual. So my definition of truth is something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with God. And something is ultimate truth if it transforms me radically and aligns me permanently with God. So truth then is about transformation. It's not about factoids. So for instance, the Dow Jones is whatever it is today. I have no idea what it is. If I were to tell you what the Dow Jones today is, would you be radically transformed and become an enlightened being? I doubt it. So that's just a factoid. So it may be a fact, but it's not true. It has no power to transform you. Now, something can be fictitious, but radically transformative, like the story of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus tells a story of a Jewish man who's on his way from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he gets mugged and he's left dying on the side of the road. And a Jewish priest passed by, sees a fellow Jew dying on the side of the road, but he can't touch the body, because if he touches the dying person, he's unclean and he can't enter the temple and perform his duty. So he passes by. And then a Levite comes by, they're the temple police, and he's under the same restrictions. He passes by and leaves his fellow Jew at the side of the road dying. And then a Samaritan comes, who are the sworn enemies of the Israelites of the time, and he sees this Jewish man. He tends to him, he pours oil into his wounds to cauterize them, puts him on his own donkey, takes him down to Jericho, checks into an inn, tends to him. He has to go away on business. He says to the innkeeper, look after this man and I'll pick up the tab when I come back. Now, if you're listening to that story and you said, there's something fishy about this story, I don't think this ever happened. And you go to the temple and you check it out with the priest. Did any of you guys go down to Jericho in the last few weeks and encounter such and such a situation? No way. And you go to Jericho and there's only 6 inns in Jericho. And you ask every innkeeper, did this situation occur? And they said, no, absolutely not. So you come back to Jesus and say, that was totally made up. Maybe it was made up, but was it true? Absolutely true. Because everybody who heard that story was totally transformed. They realized that your neighbor is not just your fellow countryman, or the person who votes the same way that you vote, or the person that has the same skin color as you. Your neighbor is all sentient being, and particularly those who are in distress of any kind. So that's my definition of truth. Now, to apply that then to kind of the problem of evil, what is the source of evil? To give a quick definition, and then I can illustrate it with some kind of analogies or metaphors, if you wish. For me, evil is the emergent result of free will decisions to make selfish choices. So again, every one of us is born on a spectrum of service to self and service to others. And the little infant is born at the end, at the service to self end. It wouldn't survive otherwise. It needs mother's milk. It needs cuddling. It needs love. It needs warmth. It wouldn't survive even physiologically without this. So we're all born at that end, service to self. But we're meant to move through life over the 50% line into service to other people, which is compassion for us, fellow sufferers. Now, if we keep making selfish decisions, we get stuck. And then evil becomes an emergent phenomenon. Now, that's an important word, emergent. Emergent means it didn't exist in the original. It was the result of the misuse of a beautiful, opportunity that God gave us. And that opportunity was free will. Now, again, there's a big difference between free will and freedom. Free will is the ability to do as pleases me. Freedom is the ability to do as pleases God. And so the only truly free person is the person who constantly makes choices for love. Selfish choices are indications that I'm exercising free will for selfishness reasons. And if I keep making selfish choices, exercising free will, I never encounter or I never reach freedom. And so evil then is an emergent phenomenon. It's not built into the original. It emerges from the constant use of free will to make selfish choices. And selfish choices inevitably lead to greed and jealousy and violence and warfare eventually. And so it's something that emerges but wasn't built into the original. It wasn't God's plan, that there be evil in the world to kind of test people in some way. So if you're interested, then I can come up with a few kind of analogies to illustrate that.
So would you differentiate then the shadow, which is part of the plan, versus the evil?
Yeah. So for me then, shadow is, I wrote an essay one time that I called Temptation, the Royal Road to Enlightenment. And so the question then becomes, how do we use shadow material? Shadow material is an invitation to exercise discernment. So it's a very important human kind of faculty. In fact, when Ignatius of Loyola founded the Jesuit order back in the 1500s, and he was training priests to be spiritual directors, he said, de discretione spirituum. This is the primary faculty you must exercise, the discernment among spirits. So discernment is the faculty that allows us to begin to make choices between, the opportunities afforded us by the shadow. And in the absence of the shadow, we may not be able to develop that faculty. If there weren't choices among which we have to make, there would be no ability to make, to exercise discernment or to kind of fine tune compassion. If everybody existed in love and there were no suffering of any kind, there would be no opportunity for developing love or compassion for anybody. And so it needs some kind of apparently less than perfect arrangement to allow us to overcome, our own fears and our own anxieties and our own antipathies, and to exercise discernment and compassion in order to access the love which is at the core of everybody and everything. And so, yes, shadow is a vitally important element in developing discernment and compassion. Now, it doesn't mean that when we act out the shadow and we murder millions of people, that we're good people, because every soul gets to kind of deal with the shadow material in its own way. So this is not to justify what the Hitlers of the world did. It is to say that, situations arose in which, people had the opportunity to respond in various ways to what was happening around them. And so I think, for instance, that, as we incarnate, every single soul only knows three things as they incarnate. And we come in cohort groups, I believe. Every soul needs, I know my own personal history of previous incarnations. I know how I've behaved, the successes and the failures of previous incarnations. So I know who I am as a player in this new drama, or that this is going to be a brand new drama. Secondly, I know that the histories of all of the characters with whom I'm going to be, sharing the stage. I know how they've behaved in previous incarnations. I know I'm going to be part of a troupe of players, some of whom are very, very poorly defined and poorly evolved souls who have had a penchant for acting selfishly and even violently in past incarnations, and are probably going to do the same thing in this incarnation. I know that as a real probability. And I know, thirdly, that my mission is to wake myself up fully during the incarnation, to help wake up my brothers and sisters, and to help to wake up those who are, kind of committed and caught with their own shadow. And so I mean it. I realize that I'm dealing with shadow material, but that is not to justify the decisions that some of these people are making, genocidal decisions that these are making. Yeah.
So then people, they're playing a shadow role as of being extremely selfish, to just, it's only their main focus is about service to self, right? Like you were saying. Are they also coming from God, which is love? They're also coming from the same fountain of love?
I think they're coming from the same fountain of love, but incarnation, as I say, creates this amnesia for all of us for who we really are. And so being born into the service to self, into the spectrum, every one of us will start out there. And for a lot of souls, they haven't progressed beyond that place in previous incarnations. So what they bring to the game is like the reality that they're probably much more likely to continue acting out from that end of the spectrum than other ends of the spectrum. And the rest of us still say, okay, I will still agree to be part of a drama in which they're very, very likely to play the same kinds of roles and do the same kind of violence as they did in the past. And I will hope, however, to wake up other people up to the realization that this is not what it is all about. And that hopefully I could be an influence even on those dark souls to make some kind of progress. And since, we're time-bound in incarnation, we make glacial progress in the course of an incarnation, in kind of waking those kinds of souls up. But we're committed to doing it on an eternal basis, because there is no such thing as time when we step out of incarnation. And so we go back to source and we do a kind of a review and say, how well did we do? Every single soul will make the review. And God will say, okay, there are lots of more opportunities of growing from selfish service to self to service to us. Do you want to make another shot at it? And I like to take this parable of Jesus where he says famously, there is more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 that don't need repentance. I take that very seriously. So what I say is, there's more joy in heaven about one soul who volunteers for incarnation than 99 souls who don't want incarnation because it's too tough and they prefer to remain in the love. And so in some, yeah.
But if we all come from love, first I wanted to say, based on what you shared about the shadow players, the people that play in the shadow role. So that means that at one point we all have played a shadow role, right? Yes. Definitely, one way or another. That's I think is a given. And then, how is it that a God that is all love is requiring us to repent in heaven? Because that stems from judgment in a way,
right? So we are never judged on the other side. It's a self-judgment. It's a kind of looking at the difference between who I am and how I've acted. And there's nobody pointing and saying, look, here what you did. So judgment is always self kind of evaluation. I don't even like the word judgment. I differentiate between judgment and evaluation. Judgment is the ontological prescription of a person or a place to evil. So, judgment is saying, X is a bad person or Y is an unhappy circumstance. That's a judgment, is putting a person or a situation into a pigeonhole. Evaluation is the determination of the appropriate response to make to a person or to an event. So I'm not in favor of judgment. I'm in favor of evaluation. If I meet a Hitler character in this incarnation, rather than pigeonhole him and judge him, I want to say, what is the appropriate response to a Hitler character in this incarnation? And it is to confront, whatever way I can, and to try to live my life in the opposite way of living out of the light. But it is a confrontation. That is not to pigeonhole or judge, but it is to evaluate what my appropriate response is to be. So at the other side, there is no judgment whatsoever. There's only this self-evaluation of, how do I need to proceed in a similar situation in a future incarnation?
I totally agree.
Yeah. So I come down on this side then, and I get the opportunity of growing further in this situation. So there's no judgment whatsoever.
It wouldn't be a judgment day, then evaluation day, which
absolutely.
Right?
What's fascinating is we've tested, actually, for example, we've taken people who have committed massive crimes like Hitler, or we did test Ted Bundy, and we've discovered that, let's say, if a Ted Bundy vibrates at a frequency of 20 or 10 out of 1,000, but then you add Ted Bundy is God.
Yes.
The frequency goes to 1,000.
Yeah.
So, and it's the same for every person we test.
Exactly.
And it just confirms that every single being plays an important role in this reality, and we're here to wake each other up.
Right. Exactly.
From the deep sleep, from this amnesia that you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And the other question I have for you about this idea of heaven, actually, we talked about it yesterday with Bruce Lipton. I'm so curious to know, because so many people say, why am I here at this time? I have amnesia. I must have had amnesia of why I volunteered. And for me, I always say, I'm grateful I'm here. I love life. And I feel that if you love life now, I can't imagine that it will be even better. Having an experience on the other side will be greater or better. And perhaps heaven and earth is here and now for all of us. And it's an awakening to recognize that, right? So would you say that heaven that so many religious scriptures talk about is an illusion?
Absolutely. It's great. Brilliant. I love it. And so it's fascinating that when I was teaching in Swahili, I would use a phrase which is it's a pun in Swahili. You can hear the pun, the kind of in the pun itself. I would say, talking about heaven, mbinguni si mahali bali ni hali. So you can kind of hear the alliteration even without understanding Swahili. Mbinguni si mahali bali ni hali. In translation, it means heaven is not a place, it's a state of mind, which it literally is. And so when Jesus is talking about the kingdom of heaven, the New Testament is written in Greek, but in Luke's gospel, he uses the phrase, the kingdom of heaven is en mesoi. And the Greek phrase en mesoi means both within you and among you. So it's an intrapsychic phenomenon, and it is an interpersonal phenomenon. It's a community phenomenon, an individual phenomenon. It's within you and it is among you. There is no place where heaven is not. So everything is contained in anything, and everyone is contained in anyone. I say sometimes there's only one human being. I call it Homo originalis. That in the same way that, when a sperm meets an egg, it creates a single cell. We call it the zygote. And then it splits in 2 and 4 and 8 and 16, 32, etc. And so now you've got 70 trillion cells in your body. But every single one of them contains all the information necessary to build you. But some of these cells have specialized, and they're eye cells. Some have specialized in their kidney cells. Some have specialized in their teeth cells. Yeah, but you can extract the DNA from any one of these cells and rebuild Alejandro or Elena. Now, I believe the same thing is true of the human family. You take any human being on the planet, and if you could extract their DNA, and I don't mean the chromosomal DNA now, I mean the spirit, the God essence within, you could recreate Homo sapiens sapiens, and even what I call Homo spiritualis, which are human beings who have awakened to their inner divinity. So there is nothing which is not God. But God needs to experience. And so let me use kind of an example from, again, my life in Kenya. I went to Kenya and I was working with peoples who, up to 1963, Kenya got its independence in December 12, 1963. Lots of the peoples of Kenya were nomadic pastoralists. And I got to work with 3 different tribes of people, Kalenjin peoples, who had been nomadic pastoralists for thousands of years. You know, camels and goats and sheep and cattle, and they wandered around looking for pasture. And now the government was forcibly settling them, but these peoples had no agricultural knowledge whatsoever. And so part of my job was to do elementary agriculture with them. Now, I lived in an area where we got just 2 months of rain every year. You know, a torrential rain for July and August every year. And then the rest of the time it was dry and temperatures like 120, 122 Fahrenheit. So I'm trying to come up with an agricultural model which can be sustained with 2 months of rain. So we started growing millet and mahindi, maize kernels. And I'm trying to teach them very, very basic elementary agriculture. And so they'd go out 4 people in a row. And the first person would go out with a little stick and he'd dig a hole in the ground every 6 inches. And the second guy is walking behind him and he's got a bag of maize kernels and he drops 2 kernels into each hole. And the third person, if the family can afford it, and not every family could, has a bag of artificial fertilizer, powder fertilizer, and a spoon. And he drops a spoon of fertilizer in on top of the kernels of maize in each hole. And the fourth guy goes on and just covers the hole with his foot. And they're walking along in a line. And then after about 6 weeks, because it's raining now, the maize is about maybe 15, 16 inches high. And they'd go out and they'd weed it. And then after about 2 months, it's like 3 feet high and they'd weed it again. And at the end of 3 months, they'd harvest it. And I'd bring them in for seminars. And I would say to them, if you had to make a choice between either fertilizing the maize or weeding it, and you want to maximize your harvest, and for some reason you're not able to do both, which is the more important, the fertilizing or the weeding? And for the first few years, they were just guessing at the answer. Subsequently, they knew. It is far more important to weed than to fertilize, because fertilizer gives growth to everything in the vicinity. You've got weeds and you've got grasses, and it just smothers the maize. So weeding is even more important than the fertilizing. And I would say to them, that is what Jesus Christ meant when he said, love your enemies, the shadow people in your life. Because you've got 2 kinds of people in your life. You've got the weeders and the fertilizers. The fertilizers are the people who love us unconditionally. But if we only had fertilizers in our lives, we'd all become total narcissists. We'd never leave the service to self end of the spectrum. We all need weeders in our lives. And even if they take great joy in pointing out our inadequacies, or even if they exaggerate them wildly, they're pointing to something that would be good for us to look at. And so every one of us is going to experience weeders in our lives, and we are going to be weeders for other people's. So it's not like we're the shining lights, and the others are the shadow figures. There's shadow material in all of us. So every single one of us is a weeder for somebody else. So the thing becomes then, can I learn from the weeders and learn from the fertilizers in my life? So the shadow people, in some senses, are the people who allow us to weed, in our own lives.
Mm-hmm.
So beautifully said.
Yes. I said once, we are all light workers.
Absolutely.
Some are turning it on and others are turning it off.
And I think it's a dimmer switch, Alejandro. So it's not just on or off, that person is completely black or completely in the light, but there's a dimmer switch. You can decide the level of luminosity. So enlightenment for me is a dimmer switch. I don't think there's anybody, who's fully enlightened. There are people who are very, very near it, very near it. But, to reach full enlightenment is to kind of leave the wheel of karma, unless you take a bodhisattva and decide to come back like a Jesus figure or a Buddha figure, because they have no karma to work out, but they're trying to wake up the rest of us. But so for me, it's like a dimmer switch. So how far up the dimmer switch are you prepared to push the luminescence?
That's excellent. It sounded like you were describing consciousness when you were describing God in a way.
Yes, absolutely.
It's everywhere, and everything is God, and everything is consciousness as well.
Fabric of the universe, yes.
Yeah.
Which brings us into right now, as a collective, I think we are experiencing this absolute split. It is so obvious, whether it's happening in your personal home or your friendships, or just look at the state of the world period, right? People have split into 2, but you're talking about that there's 3 types of humans. Yes. And I'd love to hear about that.
Okay. So I live on a mountaintop in the middle of the forest. My nearest neighbor is about half a mile away, and then the next one is 2 miles away. My nearest neighbor is my own soulmate. She's my best friend, and she's also my homeopathic physician. But apart from that, I can't see houses anywhere. But there's a creek that runs through my property called Pina Creek. And it's about 500 feet below my home. And I spent a lot of time down there. And before my dog died, she and I would go trekking down there regularly, and I would sit at the side of the creek. And I would have these extraordinary experiences, interdimensional experiences. And on the 12th of December in 2012, I was sitting at the banks of the river, and this being, I could suddenly see this being sitting to my left. And he was chewing on a blade of grass. He looked like an old farmer chewing on a blade of grass. And in my mind, I knew he was debating, should I or should I not tell him a story? And telepathically in my own, I picked a blade of grass myself. I started chewing it myself. And the two of us are sitting side by side, chewing on blades of grass. And in my mind, I said, yeah, tell me a story. He turned to me and he said, okay, I will, out loud. And he told me this fascinating story. And I subsequently wrote it. I called it The Gardeners. And basically, it was a story about a garden, a very, very barren garden that was just a rock, basically a rock, discovered by a gardener from a different planet who came down and he brought earth there, and he created an atmosphere around it, and he planted some phlox material there, and he weeded it and he watered it, and he came back again and again, and he genetically modified it over the years. And finally, they had this beautiful garden that was growing all kinds of flora. And at one stage, he genetically modified it, and it began to create fauna of various kinds, winged creatures and creepy crawlies and marine life and stuff like that. And then he said to me, at this stage, I've done this many, many, many times on many, many different planets. And this is the stage where it gets very interesting, because I can never predict what's going to happen once fauna emerge from the flora. What's going to happen? Because, it's different on every planet I've tried it. Sometimes it's really successful, sometimes it's not. And so he said, I came back to this planet, and I helped the fauna develop until finally it threw up a life form, Homo sapiens, that was capable of recognizing its own divinity. But it couldn't recognize the divinity of all other creatures. And that's the bifurcation point. That's in every planet, that is the telling point. That is what is going to happen here. Are they going to destroy themselves out of their greed and their violence, ecologically or through some kind of a nuclear holocaust, or will they break through into what Nikolai Kardashev talked about, a type 1 civilization or a type 2 civilization or a type 3 civilization? Will they make the breakthrough, or will they destroy themselves? And I can never predict what's going to happen. And he said, I'm seeing right now on planet Earth that there's a trifurcation happening. And the names I've given to them, one of them is Homo artificialis. And it's a group of humans who are being programmed and modified in various ways to become cyborgs or just robots. And there are many ways in which this has been done over the last 40 years. So there will literally just be robots or cyborgs in the service of the second group, whom I call Homo sociopathicus, people who are dedicated to greed and to violence and to warfare. And thirdly, Homo spiritualis, people who are waking up to their own divinity, and are accessing their own godhood. And he said to me, here's the job. I cannot predict which way it's going to go. In other planets, it's gone in various ways. Some have made the breakthrough into much higher forms of love and light, and others have destroyed themselves. So you're at a stage right now on your planet where it's up to you to decide. And so for me, it became a clarion cry to say, no, there is no way I will agree to become Homo artificialis. And my job is to try to confront Homo sociopathicus. And my other job is to try to wake up the other lions, the other awakening ones, to the realization that we need to to fight for the soul of the planet itself and not allow Homo sociopathicus to win the day. And so that's where we're poised right now. So it's a moment of extraordinary opportunity, because nothing, wakes up people as quickly as a global crisis. In the absence of a global crisis, people just kind of wake up temporarily, put a Band-Aid on a small problem, and then go back to sleep. unless there's a crisis of global proportions that wakes up enough people, and wakes them up sufficiently that they will never again go back to sleep, and are prepared to carry out major renovations of all of the structures of our planet, our agricultural policy, our financial policy, our educational policy, our medical policy, our religious policy, our political policies. Unless we're prepared to radically redo those, Homo sociopathicus is going to win the day. But in my own soul, I know that Homo spiritualis will win, but we're in for one hell of a fight.
Would you say that these Homo artificialis, or where is this agenda coming from? That's the question. Is it from extraterrestrial forces that are bringing this on Earth?
Or just humans that have a different perspective?
So it is a multifactorial equation. So I did a retreat for my own community in March of this year, a 3-day retreat, where I looked at the problem of evil over the course of 6 lectures. And my opinion was that it is a multi-factored equation. And so if you look, for instance, at a kind of fundamentalist religion, it says all evil comes from human disobedience to God. That's the story of Genesis. That's a simplistic analysis of it. When you look at the teaching of Jesus, he says it's from 2 sources. He calls it the world, fundamentalist religion, and secularism, the demythologizing of the world. And secondly, through the demonic spirits, extraterrestrial or certainly non-human entities. When Paul came on the scene, he talked about 4 origins for it. He talked about the very same thing as Jesus, demonic forces. He said, our battle is against the forces, the dark forces of the heavens, and the controlling forces of planet Earth, and the flesh itself, and law, the institution of law, particularly bad law that makes it almost impossible for people not to be lawbreakers and therefore be punished and create a punishment as a modality. So Paul is talking about 4 different possibilities. In my own analysis, I looked at, extraterrestrial influences. I looked at the fact that evolutionarily speaking, we are descended as Homo sapiens sapiens from lower life forms. We came from mammals, who came from previous life forms that, inhabited spacesuits, where predation, predator-prey was part of the journey. Animals killed each other in order to eat. Even chimpanzees in Gombe, Tanzania, shockingly practiced infanticide, and the genocide of other groups of chimpanzees. So we literally inhabit spacesuits where we've kind of inherited a predilection and a predisposition for physical violence, even to meet our food needs. So that's a factor that we inhabit these things. So it's not that we came down here, in a kind of a spacesuit, which had no kind of a predisposition to violence. So I look at all these factors. I look at our use of free will. I look at, what I understand by karma, and I factor all these in. For me, there's like 5-6 different factors that come together to create a predisposition and a predilection for acting out both our animal nature and the kind of the agenda of beings who literally get energized from human distress. In the same way that, can you imagine, that human beings get off, psychologically by having 2 dogs fight each other to death, or by, having cockfighting where they kill each other, or getting into 10,000 people in a boxing arena where 2 men are beating the crap out of each other. Yeah, kill him, kill him, kill him. So that human beings literally get off emotionally on witnessing the distress of other human beings, that it might well be that there are extraterrestrial forces who literally are psychic vampires, who literally feed on human distress. And in order to create an appropriate menu, they create war situations and greed situations where on a regular basis, they replenish their pantry. So I think there are many, many factors. And as Homo spiritualis, we need to realize that we're contending against all these and have to elevate beyond all 5 of those factors.
Yes, and it's interesting because what we're also realizing through testing many systems is there is this spiritual bypassing where the light is also being hijacked when people are going into all these so-called journeys, right? Using external substances to bypass the actual life experience. And this is also where we feel that this hijacking happens. We've been able to see it in people's biofield readings as well.
The use of psychedelics. Right?
Yes.
Right. So I got an interesting hit on that, and I haven't done psychedelics myself. But for me, it's like there are many ways to experience altered states of consciousness. But there's a difference between an altered state of consciousness and altered stages of consciousness. Anybody can have, altered states of consciousness. You do it when you're dreaming at night, when you're sleeping at night, in meditation of various kinds, in psychedelic substances, you can alter your state of consciousness. The example I use is, if I wanted to climb, a mountain, let's say it's 15,000 feet, let's say Kilimanjaro. Kilimanjaro is about 17,000, and it's right on the border of Kenya and Tanzania. And so I saw it regularly. Suppose I wanted to witness the view from the top of Kilimanjaro. And there are two ways of doing it. Now, this isn't quite possible, right? Imagine they made a cable car to the top of Kilimanjaro. There isn't one, not yet at least, thank God. But they made a cable car to the top of Kilimanjaro. So I can step into a cable car, and in an hour and a half journey, I can ascend 17,000 feet, and I can see this extraordinary panorama. And now I understand, wow, this is amazing. I know where the towns are situated. I can see the animal migration pattern. Now I come back down. Now, if I were to take a trip up Kilimanjaro, it's going to take me 5 days. Round trip is going to take me 5 days. And during that process, I'm going to have to experience cold. I'm camping out. I'm going to be bitten by mosquitoes. I'm going to have to light campfires. I'm going to have to cook my food. So by the time I get to the top of Kilimanjaro, I've had a totally different experience. I'm looking at the same scenario at the top, but I have a totally different experience in getting to the top and then coming back down from the top. Now, for me, that is using psychedelics as a cable car to have an experience and then repeating that experience ad nauseum. But I'm not growing at all. I am experiencing a state of consciousness, but I'm not experiencing stages of consciousness. I'm not growing in the process. I'm simply, experiencing the same state again and again and again with no growth. So that's, I think, maybe as a once-off, or kind of to alert people to the fact, yes, there are different, states of consciousness. There are different dimensions, and they can be accessed. But the way to grow is to access them through maybe meditation or time spent in nature. It is not to do it artificially, because artificial, methodology isn't going to change you as a person. It's only going to give you a kind of an experience until finally the experience kind of wanes, because you need more of the substance to get the same output.
Mm-hmm. It's not transformational in a way.
Yeah, it's not transformational. Yeah, it's informational in the sense that you've got data bits and you've had one experience, but it is not an experience that's likely to kind of change your life in perpetuity and make you a different person in your day-to-day relationships.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Beautiful. So to conclude, what would you say your advice would be to humanity at this time to access their own divinity?
Okay. So the first thing I think is spending quality time around little children, and particularly children between ages of maybe 2 to 5. Because their experience is driven by their imagination. And again, I have a very different definition of imagination. Imagination is not the faculty that allows us to make up stuff that's not real. That is not imagination. That is fantasy. Imagination is the ability to volitionally change my state of consciousness, access different dimensions, interact with entities and energies that reside in those different dimensions, learn from them, and then bring that learning back and cross-fertilize it with this waking state of consciousness. Mm-hmm. Kids do that naturally most of the time. And so they join in children's games, not patronizing, oh, nice boy, tell me what you're doing, to actually get into the same space that kids get into. And it's harder for us adults. And so it's not about patronizingly kind of pretending to indulge their fantasy, because it is not a fantasy, it's imagination. So spending quality time with kids and seeing if you can surf the same wave that the child is surfing right now. That's the first piece. The second piece would be spending quality time in nature and realizing that there are beings all around us whose sensory range is far, far bigger than ours. Snakes, for instance, can see into the infrared range that we cannot see. Bats can hear up to 100,000 cycles per second, we can only hear up to 20,000 cycles per second. So you take the range of the human sensorium, and there are beings out there who have much more extensive ranges in their sensorium than we have in ours. So watch them doing what they're doing. So time spent in nature is very important. I think meditation is vitally important. Laughter is very important. The entire function of life is to laugh at the illusion that we've bought into since we were born. And it's not a derisory laughter. It's a laughter at the realization that I really thought that I am this spacesuit, not realizing that this is just a role I'm playing. So there's a role self that I call Seán. And then there's a soul self, which is eternal, which was never born and will never die, which is a holographic fractal of source. And then there's source self, of which everything is simply a manifestation. And so meditating like that, I'd say for just off the top of my head, there'd be 3 important practices.
That is
That's
so
beautiful.
beautiful.
Yes, very profound, and I totally agree. It's definitely the way.
I love it. I always say that to me, I say imagination is a huge part of being creative. And I love that you said that being with children, because oftentimes I'll say to people, connect to your childlike essence, because that is your true essence. That will take you to the magic and beauty of what is.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Nature has a great way of reminding us to do that. So thank you, Seán, so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
And for sharing. And where can people find you?
So my website is Spirits in Spacesuits. All one word, spiritsin spacesuits.com. It's because we are spirits in these spacesuits.
Yes.
These are just costumes we wear for the purposes of playing a particular role in a particular incarnation. So we need to disidentify with this and re-identify with the source self. So my website then is spiritsin spacesuits.com.
That's wonderful. And I know that your book, people can purchase it from your website, but also Amazon, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Amazon is probably the easiest because there are 2 versions. There's a kind of what do you call a Kindle version. I think it's about $6.99, and then the print version I think is like $22.99. Yeah.
Okay.
It's
Well,
beautiful.
It's beautiful. Yes. Thank you so much, Seán, for this wonderful conversation, and we look forward to seeing you again.
God bless you guys, and a big thank you for the work that you guys are doing in our world. You are definitely part of Homo Spiritualis. So keep waking up the other lions.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. You too.
Appreciate you. Thank you.
God bless you.